Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. While I go through some quick housekeeping, it would be great if people attending could take just a moment to type into the chat where you're from and what you do, just to give us a sense of who's attending today. Today's webinar is going to be a lightning round on federal funding for state data systems. I'm going to briefly share some high-level considerations about federal funding streams that can be invested in state P20W data systems. I will then turn to our panel to talk about the federal emergency relief funds and the value of carving out some of those funds for enhancing data systems to address policy priorities. We'll save a few minutes for questions at the end. Please don't hesitate to submit those questions throughout, as we have people watching the question box to see them as they come in. By way of introducing the topic, P20W data systems, which are systems that connect statewide information from early childhood through K-12 education, post-secondary education, and the workforce, are critically important tools for state and local policymakers, system leaders, researchers, practitioners, and many other stakeholders. By connecting data across time and sectors, longitudinal data systems have the potential to help individuals like Grace navigate key decision points on their journey in and out of education and the workforce by ensuring that people supporting individuals like her have appropriate and secure access to information. They also provide information that helps leaders drive system improvements, target resources effectively, and understand the impact of their investments. However, P20W data systems and the broader state data ecosystem surrounding them are not one-time investments. Even states with robust data systems must identify new opportunities to grow and improve their systems to ensure that they are serving stakeholder needs. State policymakers have a critical role to play in evolving their data systems because prioritizing investments in data is ultimately a policy decision. Today's webinar is going to look at the federal sources of funds that states can tap into to support data system improvements. DQC's federal funding resource, which was updated just this week, illustrates the funding programs across federal agencies that can be used for this purpose. It includes both a snapshot view seen here and also a more detailed version that has language that describes allowable uses as well as some relevant citations. Some of these funding streams are dedicated for data and are likely familiar to you, such as the State Longitudinal Data System Program and Workforce Data Quality Initiative grants. Other funding streams include data as an allowable use, such as some of the programs under the Perkins Career and Technical Education Program, or are flexible, and some funds can be used for data, such as child care and development block grants. Of course, all of these funds need to be used to support many critical program purposes, but pulling small amounts from across programs to support state data ecosystems could add up to a pretty significant investment. Right now, there's a particularly unique opportunity to make use of one-time funds for this purpose by tapping into the federal emergency relief funds, which is what we're really going to dig into today. So I am now going to turn to our panel to illustrate this further. So I am very excited to introduce today's panelists who are joining me for this conversation. With us are Jed Herman, who is a senior advisor for policy outreach at the U.S. Department of Treasury, Kristen Lotz, who is the director of evidence and impact at the Tennessee Department of Finance and Administration, and Michael Bonte, chief performance officer for the Colorado Department of Higher Education. So by way of introduction, can each of you talk a little bit more about where you work and how your role intersects with your state's data ecosystem, including your P20W data system? And Kristen, I will start with you.
Great, thanks, Jane. And I'm so glad to be here with you all today to talk about some things that we're doing in Tennessee. But I am Kristen Lotz, as Jane said, the director of the Office of Evidence and Impact with the state of Tennessee. Our office is just a little over 2.5 years old at this point in time. We were created with a mission to make better use of data and evidence, both in policymaking and budgeting in Tennessee. Now, we do this in a number of ways, but one of the primary areas of focus for us has been advancing the sharing of data between our agencies and creating an environment for enterprise data analytics for the executive branch in Tennessee. So with that in mind, one of the first things that we did when this office was created was to move our P20W system from where it had previously been housed at the University of Tennessee to our internal strategic technology solutions, or STS as we call them, office, and under the purview of OEI. But what we are looking to do is move that system into a brand new enterprise data analytics hub that we are about to begin implementation of, and really expand the offerings available from our P20W system. So we have some exciting things in the works with our P20W system, and I am just glad to be here and hoping to take some of your questions.
Great. Michael.
Hello, everyone. Great to be with you all today. As Jane said, I'm Michael Fonte at the Colorado Department of Higher Education. A little bit of what I do. You know, we are, of course, very committed to student success in post-secondary education in all ways, shapes, and forms at the Colorado Department of Higher Ed. And I have the pleasure of being able to help tell that story through data, being able to leverage the data that we get from a variety of post-secondary institutions and a variety of partners, and so that we can better inform all of our practices and support students in a variety of different ways. More and more, I think I've seen the connection between that post-secondary education data space and our workforce data space, being able to tell lots of great stories in terms of what those career outcomes look like. Also being able to equip students of all ages with lots of tools and resources to be able to navigate education, training, and career. One of the platforms that we use is our My Colorado Journey platform, being able to really provide that robust information to an individual to help inform them and connect them to the right education, training, and career resources that they need. And how do we curate and connect all of the data necessary to be able to provide that to an individual so that they can have the most information that they can use to make the best decision for them. So that's a little bit about me.
Great, thanks, Michael. And Jed, you are not in a state, but a little bit about your role and how it intersects with data.
Sure. As you said, I'm Jed Herman, Senior Advisor for Policy Outreach in the Office of Recovery Programs of the U.S. Treasury Department. So we're the Office of Treasury that's managing all the recovery programs. So about $450 billion from the American Rescue Plan, other related recovery bills. And our office was created just over a year ago to have a collaborative and cohesive approach to managing these programs across Treasury and working with our colleagues at other departments and with state and local governments that are the beneficiaries of many of these funds. And so my background before I was here, I've also spent some time working with states on this question of data use and evidence and evaluation. Also formerly worked in city government and in federal government as well in a previous role. And so the main intersection of our work at the Treasury Department and education and data workforce systems, as we'll talk about today, is the state and local fiscal recovery funds, which is $350 billion provided to state and local governments for use in responding to the pandemic and its economic effects. And as we'll talk about in a moment, data systems are one potentially eligible use for these funds. So back to you.
Great, thanks so much. And of course, wanted to ask that question, not just so people who know who you are, but I just think it does a great job of really illustrating how many roles are involved in planning, designing, and sustaining a data system. So talking a little bit more about the federal role, Jed, part of your job at Treasury, as you were alluding to, is to oversee the implementation of ARP funds, which is a very big job. And you and your team have pulled together a lot of great guidance about those funds. And so would love for you to describe some of the key messages in that guidance and how data systems fit in.
Sure, happy to cover that. As I mentioned, the main thing that's relevant here probably is the state and local fiscal recovery funds. And in general, these funds can be used to fight the pandemic and support families and businesses struggling with public health emergency and related economic impacts. So that's things like maintaining vital public services, even amid declines in revenue, and building a strong, resilient, equitable recovery by making investments that support long-term growth and opportunity. And so there's a variety of rules and guidance that are out there that are good resources for people to know about. One is the final rule for the state and local fiscal recovery program. And as I talk about in a minute, that has some specific provisions related to data systems, government capacity. Second is we have some reporting guidance out there that asks people questions about data and evidence and evaluation and outcomes and how they're using that data and tracking that data in ways that P20 systems can be helpful in answering some of those reporting and compliance questions. And we're also releasing this data publicly as well, so just so people know that the reporting information that we get, that is something we're releasing publicly so people could actually use data, not necessarily states, but others can use the data to do analysis on that as a part of our commitment to transparency. And so the rules for this program and the guidance really focus on accountability, effectiveness, and equity. And so that's ensuring that recipients are reporting on how every dollar is spent. And the largest recipients are required to report on the specific metrics for each project and the general eligible uses for the program that are addressing the disparate impact of the pandemic on low-income and communities of color. And so, as I said, in this context, data plays a key role in designing projects, identifying eligible recipients, tracking outcomes, looking at the equity of results. And so the final rule has a couple of provisions related to spending on data systems. And I think someone's going to drop them in the chat, but one of them is related to doing data analysis and to gathering, assessing, and using data for effective policymaking. And so this allows for activities like data gathering, data cleaning, data analysis, data infrastructure, data management, so on and so forth. And so that is an eligible use of these funds for recipients, which are state and local governments, to spend these state and local fiscal recovery funds on those kinds of data-related things. And that's for disaggregating data to look at disparate impacts of programs, cross-jurisdictional data sharing, which is very relevant here, and to better implement and measure government programs. Another eligible use in the final rule, and I think someone's going to drop that one in the chat as well, is technology infrastructure resources. So using these funds to improve access to and the experience of using government technology systems, and as well as public-facing websites, but also data management systems, and to improve the delivery of public and government services. So that's very relevant, I think, in this conversation today, and I'm sure we'll dive into that a little bit more, but that's sort of the high-level framing of how these state and local fiscal recovery funds are relevant for this questions of P20 data systems.
Thanks so much, Jed. Really helpful to draw those connections. Kristen and Michael, you are both in states that did choose to use some of your relief funds for data. We know that states and communities have many needs right now, and it can be hard to get stakeholders on the same page about how to use those resources. So can you speak to the process and climate in your state that allowed agency leadership to work together towards a vision of cross-sector data use and how it fits in with leadership policy priorities? And Michael, why don't you start for this one?
Sure, no, very happy to. So it's an amazing opportunity to be able to have these funds and to be able to use them for all of the different work that so many of us have worked on for so many years. The way that it took form in Colorado was actually through a task force. So this was kind of codified by something called House Bill 21-1330, which was a task force given to us by the legislature and had representation from workforce, from higher education, from all different types of sectors within Colorado. You'll see there the main page on our website to kind of a lot of that process, who was on the task force, all of those different meetings, all the rest. What led into that was robust conversations of how to spend about $100 million of state and federal stimulus to be able to revitalize the workforce and improve student success. And so you'll see in those reports that we kind of distilled lots of things. We, as you can imagine, had lots of ideas of how to spend those dollars and what that could look like. I think we had 97 recommendations, which we then distilled down to 37, which we then further distilled down to 16, I think, and then tiered them within the main report. And so all of that is in there that you can kind of see and digest. One of the ones that I was very heartened to see included in there was around better metrics around post-secondary and workforce success for students who are in post-secondary education, and being able to have better connections between post-secondary data and workforce data and all that goes into that. So actually through the legislative session that just wrapped up, we had a bill called HB 22-1349, which really set us up in terms of making a better post-secondary ecosystem, a data ecosystem for all that we do, being able to rethink how we talk about measures and metrics, how we invest in the data infrastructure needed for all that, and how we can aim for deploying a true statewide longitudinal data system in Colorado and what all that means and looks like. So a lot of more detail in all of those resources in the chat too.
Thanks. Kristen.
So we're really fortunate in Tennessee to have an administration who really understands the importance of making data-driven decisions. And they have really prioritized utilizing evidence and data in decision making, and they have made it a priority for our departments as well to incorporate evidence and evidence-based programming into all of the work that they are doing. In fact, the current administration created our office, the Office of Evidence and Impact, which I believe really shows a dedication to making sure that we're investing in evidence-based programming. In addition, they have been supportive in the way of funding for the work that we are doing. We have been able to have recurring funding put in the budget by our governor and his staff, not just for our office, but for program evaluation now, for enterprise data analytics that we are including our P20W system in. So we have been fortunate in that we have had that sort of executive level support that I think is really critical to success in states. But you're right about the competing interests and priorities among our various state agencies. And so we've taken a really deliberate approach at coordinating with them, having regular communication. We've gone around and done listening sessions. We want to make sure that the work that we are doing is having value for them and they're able to put into practice what we are able to gain in the way of insights by the new ways that we're using their data, the ways that we are helping them to have their programs evaluated. And so it's a lot of listening. The support that we have from our governor's office is critical. And really, it's about ensuring the value for each of those stakeholders that you're working with.
Great, thanks so much. And what jumps out to me about both of your stories is how much your data systems were really tied to a vision in your state that was addressing real problems for real people. You created a really clear line of sight for all stakeholders in terms of what you were trying to do. So Kristen and Michael, sticking with you for just a minute, what you did isn't easy. And sometimes we hear that states are not sure that funding streams like this one can be used for data projects. So what strategies did you use to feel confident about how you were using funds? And through that process, what investments were you able to secure or set aside for your data projects? Kristen, let's go to you to start.
So we, again, of course, as I said, we're very fortunate to have the support of our administration who understands the value of investing in programs that work, making sure we have the data and evidence to support what we're doing. And so that in itself, I think, was helpful for us in this process. We also, of course, read the Treasury guidance that Jed has put in the chat for each of you. And so we saw that there was an opportunity, particularly around data projects, data infrastructure that could dovetail really nicely with the enterprise data analytics work that we had underway as we look toward eventual implementation of a brand new enterprise data analytics hub for Tennessee. And so in addition to that, the state of Tennessee did bring on a consultant to help us vet proposals. Proposals were offered by the departments to utilize the SLFRF dollars, and they went through various stages of review, one of which was our consultant who helped us just to ensure that our proposals did in fact meet the requirements of the American Recovery Plan and the Treasury guidance. And so through that process, we were able to secure funding for some infrastructure for our new enterprise data analytics hub. And also a little more specifically, we were able to secure funding for a use case around overdoses and deaths related to opioids, synthetic opioids, methamphetamines, places where we have seen pretty significant increases, and it's not just in Tennessee, it's really across the country since the beginning of the pandemic. And so that is going to be, along with the migration of our P20 system to the new hub, one of our very first use cases in this new platform. And so we're really, really excited about that.
Great. And Michael, same question to you.
Sure. I'll echo a lot of what Kristen said of being able to leverage so much talent to help us digest the guidance and making sure that we're in alignment with that. I think from our perspective, we worked very closely with our governor's office, the governor's budgeting and planning office, being able to work with our attorney general's office, of course, too. And I'll also say working with our legislative colleagues, really being able through, especially some of the data recommendations that we have in there, building on previous efforts that we've worked on in the past. I think that was really important, not only to be able to make sure that we're in alignment with the guidance of how we can use these funds, but that we're using these funds to make sure that we stretch out and continue a lot of the work that we've been doing for a number of years. I specifically think about a lot of the work that we've done in Colorado around return on investment for post-secondary education, and being able to really leverage that work and build on it with these funds and all of this. I also think more broadly that one thing that we did successfully was we really led with the use cases, being able to make a compelling argument of why this is important. We need to be able to invest in this data infrastructure so that we can answer this question or provide this information. And I think that also kind of resonated with everyone who was at the table, being able to find those connection pieces to the guidance, but also being able to kind of resonate hearts and minds around certain ideas, and being able to move through the legislative process.
Great. And Jed, I know you talked about it a little bit already, but anything you would add from your perspective or any more details on allowable uses of these funds for data?
Sure. I think we've heard both from Michael and Kristen really great examples of how they've been thoughtful about doing this work, building coalitions across their state, looking at the final rule. I would say a great resource for folks in thinking about this is the final rule itself. You need to remember page 4388, because that's, as you can see in the chat, those are where all the data evaluation data systems things are. But also there's a really good overview of the final rule on our website. So that's a great resource for people as well in looking at this work. So I think those are great things. Kristen also mentioned this idea they brought on a consultant. I want to underline that point as a good thing to think about doing here as well. There are some states that are bringing on full-time staff to do this work, but also adding to capacity to be able to do this work, I think is really important as well. And the guidance permits people to build their capacity to do this kind of work, to effectively administer government programs through doing this. And just dropped in the chat again, this is a specific example of the allowable use around this kind of capacity building work, which is focused not only on both what Michael and Kristen talked about building capacity around these specific programs, but also about building larger capacity to be able to effectively implement other government programs that are focused on these same questions of economic recovery and those who are impacted, whether that's students, whether that's mental health crises, as Kristen mentioned, other sort of the disparate impacts of the pandemic on certain populations. So I think those are really important to keep in mind when you're thinking about how to use these funds. And I'll just underscore the point they both made of there's no substitute for reading the guidance.
Great, thank you all. Kristen and Michael, you both started talking about proactive collaboration and building a vision of how data could be used to improve outcomes for people in your state. Now that you've allocated the funds, what are your implementation priorities? You both started to touch on this, but maybe talk a little bit more about that, and how will you sustain them? How will you continue to engage people who are involved in the planning at the beginning? Michael, why don't we start with you this time?
Sure. I think a lot of my focus right now is on that 1349 bill and all that goes into that in terms of the new measures and metrics around post-secondary success and workforce success, and being able to support kind of the data system and a visualization of that data and those metrics in a certain way to be able to help inform practice. So I think that will be a lot of the work that we start very much in earnest has already begun, but we'll lean in even more over the course of the remaining calendar calendar year. And because these funds are time limited, making sure that we use those expeditiously for all of this wonderful work. For that 1349 data bill, we actually were able to allocate $3 million to this work. So really excited to have that support and be able to have that take us to the next level. And in terms of sustainability, I think it gets back to what I said earlier, in braiding this with existing or related kind of legislative work here in Colorado, whether it's the ROI work, whether it's other types of SLDS work, or other efforts afoot on that front. I mentioned My Colorado Journey, our tool to help with that navigation of education and career. Thinking about those things all together and how we can leverage this funding to support them, and also then making the case to our wonderful legislature that we might need additional support recurring to be able to continue this and to continue to build on all that we're going to build. And so I think that being able to tie it back to those known use cases that they have maybe invested in the past has been an effective strategy for us.
Great, Kristen.
With the implementation of our new enterprise data analytics hub, our stakeholders can really make or break us. We are dependent on them to develop use cases, to provide their data, to join us in this new program, this new area of work. And so with all of that, continued collaboration is absolutely critical. In fact, we have some meetings tomorrow with all of these folks to sort of kick things off with regard to the implementation with all of them. And we're looking forward to that. But we need this to be something that is not just valuable to the handful of us that work in the Office of Evidence and Impact. We need this to be something that is truly valuable to our agencies, and that they can take these insights that we're able to gain with their data and make positive change, whether that be through policy or budgeting or both. And so with the development of use cases, Michael talks a lot about use cases, and that's really the approach that I think you need to take with this sort of endeavor. We're looking to them to help construct those use cases, to really be a part of the whole process from beginning to end. And we're focused on making sure that they're a part of how we define success with this work. And another thing that we're really focused on with regard to implementation in these very, very early stages would be governance. I think that's really important to get that right. And so we have a clear vision laid out around that. We have an enterprise data analytics leadership committee that is comprised of commissioners of a handful of our state departments who are really helping us to prioritize these use cases that we are gathering from the departments. They're helping us set metrics and really helping to be champions of this work throughout state government. So those are some early thoughts on implementation and just continued collaboration with our stakeholders.
Great, thanks so much. And Jed, from your perspective, and you've kind of woven this throughout your remarks, but wondering if you have any final thoughts on why is it so important to consider using relief funding for data projects like this?
Yeah, I'll just rewind a second and I guess zoom back a little bit and say why in general is it important to use funds to build government capacity, of which data systems are obviously an important use. Is, you roll back the clock to 2008, 2009, 2010, the Great Recession, and you look at what happened to state and local government budgets. The effects, those budgets didn't rebuild for nearly a decade, right? There was a hollowing out of public sector workforce, the ability of those governments to respond to the needs of their residents, which were greater during that recession, was severely diminished. And so we're learning the lessons of that from this time around. We're saying, you've heard about people able to make investments in building their capacity from Chris and Michael because they have the funds to be able to do that. That really wasn't the case, in 2008, 2009, 2010, or even all the way up through 2016, governments had the funds to do that. So the ability to invest funds in building capacity, having effective governments that can respond to this is really important. And Chris was talking about sort of the widespread impact of that. I know we focus a lot on today on how funds are going to states. These funds are going to literally every government in the country, over 30,000 recipients. So while there are big states like Tennessee or Colorado that may be able to think about making these investments in ordinary times, many of these smaller governments just don't have the resources to do that. And so this sort of working with other stakeholders, bringing in other jurisdictions, building capacity of the consumer governments, right? Colorado and Tennessee are working with local school districts and others to be able to use this data. They need the capacity to do that work as well. It's not just building the system and then you're done, as Kristen said, and Michael, there's a lot of engagement needs to happen. So these funds can really allow for that capacity, for people to build that capacity. And Treasury rules are focused on that, right? Addressing the underlying disparities, right? Building long-term capacity, strong, resilient, equitable recovery. I just want to say one last word on the equity pieces of this, which is we also saw in the Great Recession, that the impact of this on low-income communities of color, they didn't recover in some cases for almost a decade as well. And we've seen already that, for example, Black and Latino unemployment has gone back to where it was before the pandemic. That's because we've made investments, but we wouldn't know that. We don't know the impacts of those unless we're tracking that. So things like data systems allow us to understand what those impacts are, disaggregate data, right? Our Treasury guidance encourages people to disaggregate data, not just to understand what the effects are on particular populations. And so that's only impossible if you have capacity and you make investments in the way that these rules allow you to do, and these states we've heard from today are doing.
Great. Thanks so much, Jed. I have one last question before we check to see if there are any audience questions. So for states that are considering investing relief funds or other federal funds in their P20W data systems, what advice would you give to them? And for this one, I guess, Jed, let's start with you and then go to Kristen and then to Michael.
Yeah, I just hit the equity point, but thinking about the equity considerations of all this, that's not just equity and, as I just mentioned, how you use the data to look at disaggregating data, but also think about equity in the way that you're building those systems, right? What, traditionally that maybe wasn't taken so much into account. And there, I think, perhaps faults in some systems that people are going back and fixing because of that. So I think understanding what the equity implications are, as Michael talked about, understanding how you want to use these funds, right? From our perspective, Treasury, as I keep saying, these funds are about building effective government capacity to implement programs. So thinking about how the system is going to help you do that kind of work, rather than just building a system for the purpose of being able to have data in one place.
And for folks who are considering using some of these funds for, well, really any purpose, but data system improvements or anything related to data, I would say, to Jed's point, read the guidance, number one. But also, I think, it's really important to make sure that if you are using these funds or any funds to create or modernize a data system, what Jed said is absolutely right. We're not just creating a repository for data just so that we can say we did that. It really is about the developing of the use cases. It's about working with the stakeholders to understand what the issues are, what the policy questions are, and developing these use cases that can help your stakeholders. I'm so sorry, Nashville allergies. So that you can help them answer these policy questions that they have. It has to be, I think, really business centric, business focused, and not, well, let's just create this new sort of IT system and declare victory. So it takes a really thoughtful approach.
I will echo everything that Jed and Kristen said. And we've talked about how important those use cases are that can really move the hearts and minds of individuals to rally the cause around all of this work. What I'll also say is I think it's important that in building the use cases and doing the stakeholder engagement, that the fostering of trust is very important. We've come a long way in terms of what we can all do technologically. And I don't think that there's too much that technology limits us on. We can do so much, but what does limit us is needing to connect with each other, is needing to be able to have those connections between different agencies, different stakeholder groups, and making sure that people know that this is why we're doing this work. We're not doing it just to have one big data warehouse of things. It's because of these good and hopefully noble pursuits. I'll also say that, and this is something that our executive director, Dr. Angie Picconi, says a lot, is whenever we're doing this stakeholder engagement or involving a lot of different groups, what we're not doing is rallying buy-in. What we're rallying is co-ownership in this work. And I think that helps each person see themselves in what we're building together. And I think there's an important distinction there, because then people are more likely to participate, take that seat at the table, and really hopefully remove barriers that might exist to actually getting this work done.
Great, thanks so much. So we'll take a look to see if we have any questions from the audience, and people should feel free to keep submitting them. Just by way of starting, as I looking here to see what we have. So touching on one, so as we all know, some of these emergency reliefs are one-time funding. So what would you say are some of the important steps, and anyone can take this that has thoughts on this, what are some of the important steps that you think that people in the state should be taking to keep up the momentum for this project and future projects as you invest in the system long-term, whether that's a collaboration with a local agency, cross-state data sharing, the specific projects you're talking about? Any thoughts on, I guess, that idea of sustainability as you look forward?
I'll just take that and building actually a little off the point that Michael just made about stakeholder engagement is we, in our compliance and reporting guidance, lean very heavily on especially the largest governments to think about how they design their projects by engaging the community to get their feedback. In my mind, that is important both because it ensures equitable and effective use of funds, but also because it's about sustainability. If, as Michael said, there is support for these kinds of projects, people understand what they're doing, that they're in their interest, and they've had a voice in deciding what they were going to be used on, I think that's a key towards sustainability. So while these are certainly limited funds that allow for good infrastructure investments, one-time uses, the key to carrying on a lot of that work, I think, is, as we talked about, having use cases that are getting results, but also making sure that people are understanding and they've had a voice in how these funds are used. So I think that community engagement, that focus on equity, focus on use cases is a real key to sustainability.
Anything to add, Kristen or Michael?
No, I thought that was a beautiful answer. Exactly right. No notes.
Great. And Jed, it looks like there's a question directly for you in the chat that if you want to try and field now, you can, or we can follow up later. It looks like states need Treasury support in terms of data as well as funding. Have there been any conversations you are aware of to allow ways that states can connect with IRS data to provide a more complete view of employment outcomes as well as out-of-state migration for ongoing meaningful analysis purposes?
I always love a good tax question.
Yeah.
I will punt a little bit and say that, one of the things that work at Treasury, while IRS is one of our agencies, we do have a pretty strict line in terms of our involvement in tax policy or tax related data. So I don't know the conversations going on or not going on, but I wouldn't know. So that's really a great question to ask the IRS, and happy to find a follow-up contact there if you'd like to reach out. But I don't get involved in tax policy issues, so sorry.
One thing that I might chime in on that might be helpful, that it makes me think of when I read that question, is some work that the U.S. Census Bureau has done around the post-secondary employment outcomes work, or PSEO work, which enables different departments of higher education in states, and I think also systems of higher education, to share data with the Census Bureau. Census Bureau then looks at those wage outcomes using the federal UI data. I think they're also trying to get other IRS data. and be able to show the median 1, 5, and 10-year earnings outcomes from people from certain post-secondary institutions. There's also some employment flows data that they've also incorporated into that work. So that might be helpful in terms of some of that post-secondary and workforce connection. Just want to throw that out there.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks, Jed. We are almost at our time for the webinar today, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. And if there were questions that we didn't get to in the chat, we are going to download the whole discussion so that we can capture them and find ways to follow up after the fact. Lots of good takeaways here. Some of that jumped out to me was that there is lots of flexibility with these funds, and a great use of them is investing them in state data systems. Another is that, you can really get your senior leadership on board with using them in this way if you take this time to start with a really clear blue sky vision and get everyone on the same page and really show that connection between data systems and your policy goals. And then, of course, just always keeping people at the center of this work, because that's who we're all serving. So thank you so much again to our panelists, and thank you to all the attendees for spending some of your afternoon with us. I've included my contact information on this final slide that we're displaying. And so if you think of questions after the fact, I can get them to the right place. We will also once more drop our federal funding resource in the chat for in case anyone joined late, so that link is available. And then we've also recorded this webinar so it can be shared with anyone who's interested, who is unable to attend today. So thanks so much again, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.